I'm here for you now, sister.
Her tiny act of mercy in a war-torn jungle 11 years ago was supposed to be forgotten. Instead, it walked back into her life wearing a tailored suit, flanked by armed men, and bowed to her in front of the husband who called her worthless. "Little sister," he said, "I finally found you." And just like that, the maid everyone mocked became the woman an empire feared to cross. Before we go further, if you believe love should never come with a price tag, hit subscribe right now. Malik mocked the woman who gave everything and asked for nothing. Don't be like him. Like this video, subscribe, and drop a comment below. Would you have stayed silent as long as Zuri did? Only the heartless scroll past. Zuri Adebayo had learned over 6 years of pushing a housekeeping cart through the marble veins of the Alicia Grand Hotel that invisibility was a kind of survival. You stopped noticing the ache in your knees. You stopped hearing the word just attached to your job title. Just a maid, just staff, just the help. You learned to smile at guests who looked through you like fog on glass. What she never learned to stop noticing was her husband's voice doing it too. "Watch the cart, Zuri, you're blocking the Hendersons," Malik Okoro said that morning, not even glancing at her as he adjusted his cufflinks in the lobby mirror. He said her name the way you'd address a coworker you tolerated, not a wife you'd promised your life to. 6 years of marriage had sanded that promise down to something thin and reused, like a bar of soap nobody wanted to throw away. Zuri didn't answer. She'd learned that too. That silence cost her less than words did. She pushed her cart toward the service elevator, past the concierge desk where 2 junior staff were snickering at something on a phone screen. She caught her own reflection in the brass elevator doors. 41 years old, headscarf tied neat, uniform pressed within an inch of its life because pride was the one thing Malik hadn't managed to steal from her yet. Behind her, she heard him laughing with a guest, that big warm laugh he saved for people who mattered. She used to think she mattered. Somewhere around year 3, she'd stopped keeping count of when that changed. The elevator dinged. She stepped in, and for one unguarded second, her hand drifted to the frayed woven bracelet she still wore, hidden mostly beneath her sleeve. A habit older than her marriage, older than this hotel. She didn't remember the boy's face anymore, not really, just his shaking hands, the smell of dust and gun oil, and the sound of her own voice telling him stories about Lagos traffic to keep him from crying. She wondered sometimes if he'd lived. If the bracelet had done anything at all besides give her something to touch when the world got too loud. She had no way of knowing that 2 miles away, in a glass-walled boardroom on the 40th floor of a building bearing a name that made grown executives sweat through their shirts, a man was reading her personnel file for the 3rd time that hour. Kang Min-jae did not fidget. He did not raise his voice. In 11 years of building an empire out of other men's fear, he had trained every visible nerve out of his body, except this one. His thumb kept returning to the photograph clipped to the top of the file. A tired woman in a housekeeping uniform, badge number 4471, employee since 2019. "Confirm it," he said without looking up. His head of security, a broad-shouldered man named Tae Yang who had seen his boss dismantle rival syndicates without blinking, cleared his throat carefully. "Sir, the acquisition closes at noon. If you go to the property before the paperwork..." "Confirm it," Min-jae said again, quieter this time, which was somehow worse. Tae Yang confirmed it. Zuri Adebayo, Nigerian national, volunteer roster Doctors Without Borders satellite camp 11 years prior. Current address, staff housing, 3 blocks from the Alicia Grand. Min-jae closed the file. He thought of a cistern, gunfire chewing up the dark, and a girl who wasn't even 25 pressing her whole body between him and the noise like she had nothing left to lose because she'd already lost everything and decided to spend what remained on a stranger's son. He thought of the bracelet he had never once taken off in 11 years, hidden under his watch, under cufflinks worth more than most people's houses. He had come to this city to swallow a hotel chain whole. Punishment for a labor scandal his people had traced through a subsidiary, nothing personal, purely business. He hadn't expected business to hand him back the one debt he could never repay with money. "Prepare the convoy," he said, "and find out everything about her life here. Everything." By noon, 3 black SUVs were gliding toward the Alicia Grand's entrance, and inside the lobby, a maid named Zuri Adebayo was calmly asking the front desk to prepare the presidential suite. Because, she said, her brother was arriving. Malik Okoro laughed so hard he had to steady himself on the concierge desk. He would not be laughing for much longer. The doors of the Alatia Grand didn't so much open as surrender. 6 men in dark suits entered first, fanning out with the unhurried precision of people who had done this in 100 lobbies before this one. Guests froze mid-sentence. A bellhop dropped a luggage cart. Malik, still catching his breath from laughing, straightened his tie on instinct, already rehearsing the smile he saved for VIPs. Then Kang Min-jae stepped through the doors, and the temperature of the room changed. He wasn't the tallest man in the lobby or the loudest. He didn't need to be. He moved like weather, the kind you didn't argue with, only prepared for. His suit was cut so precisely it looked less like clothing and more like armor that had learned to drape. His eyes swept the room once, dismissing the chandeliers, the marble, the nervous manager already hurrying forward with his hand extended. Min-jae walked past all of it, past the manager, past Malik, past 3 decades of other people's assumptions about who deserved to be seen. He stopped in front of Zuri. For a moment, nobody breathed. Zuri stood frozen beside her housekeeping cart, badge 4471 catching the light, hands still smelling faintly of bleach. She didn't recognize him, how could she? The boy in her memory had hollow cheeks and a child's fear in his eyes. This man had a jaw like a closed door and a stillness that made grown security guards look away first. Then he bowed. Not a nod. A full, deliberate bow, the kind reserved for elders, for debts that could never be settled with money. "Little sister," he said, in English rough with disuse but unmistakably certain. "I finally found you." The bracelet. His hand rose slightly, just enough to show the frayed weave at his own wrist, hidden for 11 years beneath watches worth more than the hotel's monthly payroll. Zuri's breath caught. Her fingers found the twin bracelet at her own wrist without her permission, muscle memory older than her marriage, older than this uniform. "The boy," she whispered. "The camp. You." Her voice broke on the last word because saying you lived out loud made 11 years of not knowing collapse all at once. "I lived," he said simply, "because of you." Somewhere behind her, Malik made a sound that might have been a laugh trying to survive contact with reality and failing. This has to be some kind of joke. Zuri doesn't have a brother, she's staff." He said the word like it explained everything, like it was armor. Min-jae's eyes moved to him for the first time, slowly. The way a man might look at an insect he hadn't yet decided was worth stepping on. "You are her husband," Min-jae said. It wasn't a question. Somewhere in that 40th floor boardroom, a file already existed with Malik's name on it, cross-referenced with payroll records that hadn't finished being read. Malik Okoro. "Guest relations supervisor," Malik said, puffing slightly, already recalculating whether this stranger's wealth was something to be feared or leveraged. Zuri watched the gears turn behind his eyes and felt something old and tired settle deeper in her chest. Even now, even in front of this. "I see," Min-jae said, and the 2 words carried more weight than a courtroom verdict. He turned back to Zuri, and something in his face softened, not weakness, but the particular gentleness only the genuinely dangerous can afford to show. "You saved my life for 4 hours in the dark and asked for nothing. I have spent 11 years and more money than this hotel is worth trying to find you so I could finally ask, what do you need? Name it." The lobby had gone so silent that the elevator chime sounded like a gunshot. Zuri opened her mouth, closed it. In 6 years at this hotel, no one had ever asked her that question. Not the guests, not management, not the man standing 3 feet away wearing her husband's name like a costume. She didn't know how to answer a question that big. Not yet, not with her hands still shaking and bleach still under her fingernails. "I need," she said slowly, "for someone to tell me this is real." Min-jae almost smiled. "Tae-yang," he said without turning, "pull the acquisition paperwork. I want to know exactly who has been signing off on this woman's payroll for the last 3 years." Malik's confident posture flickered. Just barely. Just enough for Zuri to notice, the way you notice a hairline crack in glass right before it shatters. He had no idea yet how much was about to fall out of that crack. Grief has a smell, Zuri thought later. So does humiliation. And so apparently does a man's composure collapsing in real time. It smelled like the cheap cologne Malik oversprayed whenever he was nervous, thickening in the recycled lobby air as Taeyang's men set up a folding table by the concierge desk like they were about to perform surgery. In a way, they were. "This isn't necessary," Malik said, his voice climbing half an octave higher than the register he used for guests. "Whatever this is, a misunderstanding, a stunt for the cameras, I don't know, but there's no need to involve HR matters in the lobby." "HR matters," Min-jae repeated, tasting the phrase like it was something spoiled. He hadn't raised his voice once. He didn't need to. The room had already appointed itself his audience. Phones lowering, breath held, the kind of silence that only exists right before something breaks. Interesting that you jumped to HR. I only asked who signed her payroll. A laptop opened. Taeyang's fingers moved with the calm efficiency of a surgeon who had done this before and would do it again without losing sleep. Zuri stood beside her cart, arms crossed against a cold that had nothing to do with the air conditioning, watching numbers scroll past that were supposed to represent her life and somehow didn't add up to anything she recognized. Hazard pay supplement, Taeyang read aloud, flat and unhurried. Authorized quarterly, routed to account ending 8842. He looked up. Miss Adebayo, is this your account? Zuri shook her head slowly. She'd never seen that number before in her life. It's mine, Malik said too quickly, then caught himself. I mean, we share finances. Married couples do that. It's completely normal for 3 years, Taeyang continued, unbothered. Hazard pay bonuses totaling approximately $14,000 were diverted from Miss Adebayo's compensation into an account you control, coinciding with, he scrolled, his expression never changing, which somehow made it worse. 6 separate withdrawals at Diamond Point Casino on the same or adjacent dates. The lobby, which had been merely silent, now achieved something closer to reverent. Zuri felt the floor tilt, just slightly, the particular vertigo of learning that the version of your life you'd been grieving quietly wasn't even the full tragedy. She'd noticed the gaps in the paychecks over the years. Of course she had. She wasn't a fool. She'd simply been too tired, too outmatched, too used to being told she'd miscounted, misunderstood, misremembered. Malik had a gift for making his wife doubt her own arithmetic. It turned out that gift had a price tag, and she'd been the one paying it. You stole from me, she said. Not a question. Her voice came out steadier than she expected, steadier than 6 years of swallowed anger had any right to sound. I was going to pay it back, Malik said, and even he seemed to hear how thin that sounded once it left his mouth and met open air. It was a rough patch. Everyone has rough patches. You don't understand what it's like trying to look successful when your wife is. He stopped himself half a second too late. When your wife is what? Min-jae asked, and for the first time something dangerous moved beneath his calm, like current under still water. Malik said nothing. He didn't need to. The word maid had been sitting in his mouth for 6 years, and everyone in that lobby had heard it enough times in his tone, if never quite in his words, to fill in the silence themselves. Min-jae turned to Zuri. There's more, he said gently now, the gentleness somehow more frightening than his anger had been. Security footage. 2 years of it. I'd rather you see it privately, sister, than have it become entertainment for people who have already entertained themselves at your expense enough for one lifetime. Zuri looked at Malik, really looked, the way you look at a stranger's photograph trying to place a face you used to love. She thought of every just staff, every dismissive wave of his hand in front of guests. Every night she'd come home aching and found no dinner waiting because he'd assumed she'd handle it. She always handled it. Show me, she said. All of it. I've spent 6 years not asking questions I already knew the answers to. I'm done doing that. Somewhere near the elevators, the hotel manager, sensing the exact moment his career began quietly dying, reached for his phone to call corporate, only to find 3 missed calls already waiting, all from a number he didn't recognize, all originating from the 40th floor that, as of 11 a.m. that morning, technically owned him. The manager's office wasn't built for an audience of this size, but Min-jae's men made it work, pulling in extra chairs, closing blinds that had probably never once been closed during business hours. Zuri sat with her hands folded in her lap, the posture of a woman who had learned long ago that stillness cost less than flinching. Malik hovered near the door like a man calculating exits, though everyone in the room understood there weren't any left for him. Taeyang cued the footage on the office monitor. Time-stamped, dated, methodical, 11 months of it compressed into the parts that mattered. The first clip showed Zuri, 18 months earlier, cleaning the 14th floor executive suite alone at 2 a.m. because Malik had forgotten to schedule a second housekeeper for a floor that required 2 by hotel policy, a policy he himself had signed off on in writing the week prior. She'd worked the shift solo rather than leave a wealthy guest's room unfinished, then clocked out at 4 a.m. and been back at the front desk by 9 because Malik needed her to cover so he could take a long lunch with a woman from corporate sales who was not. Zuri now understood watching his face on the monitor, discussing quarterly projections. The second clip was worse in a smaller way, which somehow made it land harder. A guest's diamond cufflink had gone missing from a room Zuri had cleaned. Malik, on camera in the manager's own office, suggesting, unprompted, helpfully, generously, that perhaps housekeeping should be searched. Zuri had been pulled aside, patted down by security in a stairwell while other staff watched, humiliated in front of people she saw every day. The cufflink turned up 3 weeks later in a drawer in Malik's own office, where he'd apparently pocketed it himself and forgotten, too consumed with maintaining the fiction of his own importance to remember the far simpler crime he'd actually committed. Zuri didn't cry. She'd expected to, somewhere in the pit of her stomach, but what rose instead was something quieter and colder, the specific, clarifying rage of finally being handed proof for a suspicion she'd spent years being told was paranoia. "Enough," she said, and Taeyang paused the footage without being asked twice. Malik had gone very pale. "Zuri, baby, I can explain every—" "Don't," she said. Just that. One syllable, and it did more work than a shouted paragraph could have. Min Jae hadn't moved from his position by the window the entire time, watching not the screen but his sister's face, cataloging every flicker of pain like a debt he intended to collect on her behalf. "There's a decision in front of you," he said finally. "As of 11 this morning, my company owns this hotel and 11 others in the chain. I could fire him within the hour. I could ensure he never works in hospitality again on this continent. I could make his name mean something ugly in rooms he'll never even know he was discussed in." Malik's face drained further at the casual, almost bureaucratic ease with which Min Jae described the unmaking of a life. "But," Min Jae continued, "this isn't my decision to make. It's yours. You are the one who spent 6 years absorbing what he handed out. Whatever justice looks like, sister, I'll build it exactly to your specifications." Every eye in the room turned to Zuri. She thought of Mama Adayes, of the seamstress who taught her that patience wasn't the same thing as surrender, that you could hold your tongue and still be sharpening something underneath. She thought of 4 hours in a cistern with a frightened boy, offering him the one thing she had, not vengeance, but a bracelet and a story about traffic to keep his mind off the gunfire. "I don't want him destroyed," she said slowly, and watched surprise ripple through the room, watched Malik's shoulders sag half an inch with something that might have been relief. "I want him to still be standing when everyone finds out exactly what he is. Ruin is quick. Everyone forgets a scandal in 6 months. I want something that lasts longer than that." Min Jae tilted his head, genuinely curious now. The closest thing to delight his carefully controlled face had shown all day. "Tell me what you're thinking," he said. "And then, sister, tell me how I can help you build it." Outside the office door, the hotel manager was already drafting his resignation letter, uncertain whether he was about to be fired or simply hadn't yet been told the timing. "I want him to work for me," Zuri said. The silence that followed had a different texture than the ones before it. Not shock exactly, but recalibration. The sound of a room realizing it had underestimated the woman at its center twice in one day. Malik's head snapped up. "What?" "Not as a supervisor," Zuri continued, and now something had entered her voice that hadn't been there in 6 years of marriage, a kind of quiet command. The tone of a woman who had spent her whole life being spoken over and had just discovered she no longer needed permission to speak first. "As housekeeping staff. Same floors I worked, same hours I worked, under a manager who reports directly to me if my brother is offering me a position, which I assume he is." Min Jae's mouth did something that, on a less disciplined face, would have been a smirk. "I was going to offer you the regional directorship of guest operations, but your proposal has considerably more style." "Zuri, you can't be serious," Malik said, the color returning to his face now in the specific shade of a man who thought the worst had passed. "I have a reputation in this industry. Cleaning rooms, that's not who I—" "That's exactly who you are," Zuri said, cutting through him with the ease of a woman folding a fitted sheet. "You've just never had to prove it with your hands before. Consider this your promotion into honesty." Min Jae raised a hand, and Taeyang produced a fresh folder, this one thinner, cleaner, evidently prepared in the 20 minutes since Zuri had started talking, which told her exactly how many contingencies this man kept ready at all times. "There's a second option," Min Jae said. "Full restitution of the stolen wages, repaid over 18 months, garnished directly from whatever position he holds. Public disclosure to hotel ownership, formal termination from any supervisory role chain-wide, and criminal referral held in reserve, not filed, but drafted, dated, and sitting in a drawer with my signature on it. If he so much as raises his voice to you again, sister, it stops sitting in that drawer." Malik looked between them, his wife and the stranger who had walked into his lobby that morning and, in the space of 4 hours, rearranged the entire architecture of his life, and understood, perhaps for the first time with total clarity, that there was no version of this conversation where he emerged as anything other than diminished. "I'll sign it," he said quietly. Not because he'd found humility, because he'd finally run out of rooms to run to. Taeyang slid the papers across the desk. Malik's hand shook slightly as he signed, a small, petty tremor that Zuri noted with the same detachment she'd once reserved for noting a guest's unreasonable room service request. She wasn't cruel enough to enjoy it, but she wasn't foolish enough to pretend it didn't feel, in some small private corner of herself, like the first full breath she'd taken in years. Word moved through the hotel faster than any memo corporate could have drafted. By the time Zuri and Minjae stepped back into the lobby, the crowd that had laughed that morning had rearranged itself into something closer to a congregation. Junior staff standing a little straighter, the concierge who'd snickered earlier now suddenly very interested in his shoes, guests whispering behind raised hands about the maid who turned out to have a mafia boss for a brother, as if the story were gossip and not, in fact, the exact moment their entire understanding of who deserved respect had been forcibly corrected. "There's something else," Minjae said quietly once they were alone by the window overlooking the valet stand, the SUVs still idling outside like patient dogs. "Something I never told you because I didn't know how to say it without sounding like I was trying to buy back 11 years I couldn't actually purchase." Zuri turned to him, and for the first time all day, she saw not the mafia boss the whole city flinched at, but the boy behind the cistern, hands shaking, waiting for the gunfire to stop. "There's a foundation," he said. "It's been running for 6 years. Scholarships, medical aid, youth shelters across 3 countries. It's funded entirely by me." He paused, and something in his jaw tightened, the closest thing to vulnerability she'd seen from him since he walked through those doors. "It's registered under your name. I didn't know if I'd ever find you to tell you that. I just knew I couldn't let what you gave me disappear into nothing." Zuri's hand found the bracelet at her wrist without her permission, the same gesture it had made 1,000 times over 11 years, except this time it wasn't asking a question, it was answering one. Zuri didn't sleep that night. Not from grief this time, from the strange, disorienting weightlessness of a life recalculating itself in real time, the way a room feels different after you've rearranged the furniture, even though nothing structural has actually changed. She'd gone home to the small staff apartment 3 blocks from the hotel. Home, though the word felt suddenly negotiable, and sat at her kitchen table with a laptop Taeyang had couriered over that evening, containing 6 years of foundation records she hadn't known existed. She scrolled through them slowly, the way you'd walk through a house you were told you owned but had never once visited. The Adebayo Kang Foundation for Youth Resilience. Her name first, which she noted with a small, disbelieving laugh into the empty apartment. Scholarships awarded to 211 students across Nigeria, Ghana, and South Korea. Kids pulled out of exactly the kind of conflict-adjacent poverty that had once left a frightened boy alone in a volunteer camp with nothing but his own shaking hands. Medical aid clinics. A youth shelter in Seoul with her name on a plaque she'd never seen, in a building she'd never visited, funded by a brother she'd spent 11 years assuming was dead. There was a video file near the bottom of the folder, dated 8 months earlier. She clicked it before she could talk herself out of it. It was Minjae, seated in what looked like the same 40th floor office she'd later come to know, recording what was clearly meant to be a message for a version of her he wasn't sure he'd ever find. "If you're watching this," he said in the same careful English, "it means I finally found you, and I don't know yet whether you'll forgive me for taking so long. I want you to know that everything good I have built, I built because a stranger decided a frightened boy was worth 4 hours of her life. I have spent 11 years trying to be someone worth that decision." Zuri closed the laptop and sat in the dark for a long time. The next morning, the Alatia Grand looked different, though the marble hadn't changed and the chandeliers still hung exactly where they always had. What had shifted was smaller and larger than that, the way the concierge greeted her by name instead of by function, the way junior staff who used to avoid eye contact now held it a beat too long, uncertain whether deference or friendliness was the correct register for a woman who'd apparently been quietly royalty this entire time. Malik was already on the 14th floor when she arrived, dressed in a housekeeping uniform 2 sizes too formal-looking for the work, pushing a cart with the stiff, unpracticed posture of a man discovering that carts have a weight and a rhythm he'd spent 6 years assuming were beneath him. He didn't look up as she passed, she didn't make him. "This is the part where you get to decide something too." Malik spent 6 years treating decency like a weakness, because he assumed no one was keeping score. If you believe love and respect should never depend on someone's job title, Hit subscribe and drop a comment below, because the moment you stay quiet about people like Malik, you're teaching them they were right all along. Only the ones who've done the mocking themselves stay silent now. By mid-afternoon, Min-jae found her on the rooftop terrace where staff took their breaks, looking out over a skyline that had, in the space of a single day, become considerably more complicated than it used to be. "There's a board seat," he said, joining her at the railing. "Not a courtesy title. Real authority over hiring, wages, working conditions, across the whole chain. I want people like you deciding what people like you deserve. I'm tired of building things that only protect people who already have protection." Zuri considered the offer the way she considered most things now, slowly, with the specific caution of a woman who'd learned the hard way what happens when you accept things too quickly. "On one condition," she said. "The scholarship program expands. I want it to reach kids exactly like the boy in that cistern, the ones nobody's looking for yet." Min-jae smiled, and for a moment the Mafia boss disappeared entirely, replaced by something simpler and truer underneath. "Sister," he said, "I would have agreed to anything. You just made it easy." Behind them, far below on the 14th floor, Malika Koro finished making a bed with hands that had never done real work in 6 years, and understood, with the particular clarity that only humiliation provides, exactly how much he had thrown away, and exactly how little chance he had of ever getting it back. 6 months later, the lobby of the Alatia Grand looked almost the same. Same marble, same chandeliers throwing the same brittle light across the same polished floors. But almost is a word that carries a great deal of weight when you know what to look for. There was a new plaque near the concierge desk now, small and unshowy, the kind of thing you'd miss if you weren't paying attention, in honor of the staff who keep this place running, seen and unseen. Zuri had insisted on unshowy. Min-jae had wanted marble and gold leaf. They'd compromised, the way family does, on something that said everything without saying too much. Zuri no longer pushed a cart, though she still visited the 14th floor most weeks, not out of obligation, but out of a stubborn, sentimental refusal to let a title erase the woman she'd been while earning it. As regional director of guest operations and standing board member of the Adebayo Kang Foundation, her signature now appeared on wage policies, on safety protocols, on the kind of paperwork that used to be signed by people who'd never once had to clean a room themselves. Under her authority, hazard pay was audited quarterly by an outside firm. No supervisor could touch an employee's compensation without 3 layers of sign-off. She had built, brick by administrative brick, a version of the system that would have caught Malik on his very first attempt, instead of letting him run for 3 quiet years. Malik still worked at the hotel. That part of the arrangement, at Zuri's insistence, had never changed. He'd lasted 4 months in housekeeping before requesting a transfer to laundry services, which she'd approved without comment, and where he now spent his days folding linens with the particular hunched diligence of a man who had finally, belatedly, learned what his wife's hands used to feel like at the end of a double shift. He didn't speak to her much anymore. There wasn't much left to say that either of them wanted to hear. The divorce had finalized quietly in the 3rd month. No drama, no lawyers shouting in hallways, just 2 signatures and the strange anticlimactic relief of watching a door close that had been half open for years. He had, to his credit, stopped mocking her. It's difficult to look down on someone from the floor. The scholarship program had grown to 470 students across 3 countries by the time Zuri stood at the ribbon cutting for the 2nd youth shelter. This one not in Seoul but in Lagos, 3 blocks from the neighborhood where Mama Adaes had once taken in a grieving orphan, the way some people take in stray cats, grudgingly, and then completely. Mama Adaes herself sat in the front row in her best church dress, 81 years old, and still sharp enough to heckle the mayor's speech under her breath, and when Zuri caught her eye across the crowd, the old woman simply nodded, the way she used to nod over a well-stitched hem. "Good work, girl. Good work." Min-jae stood beside Zuri that day, no longer flanked by 6 men in dark suits, just one quiet driver waiting at a respectful distance. He'd learned over 6 months that his sister didn't need armed protection so much as she needed someone to show up. That was a harder lesson for a man like him, and he'd taken to it with the same terrifying discipline he brought to everything else. "You know," he said, watching a boy of maybe 12 accept his scholarship certificate with shaking hands, unable to stop smiling, "I used to think I owed you a debt I could never repay. Money, protection, power. I threw all of it at the idea of you for 11 years because it was the only currency I understood." "And now?" Zuri asked. "Now I think you never wanted repayment," he said. "You just wanted someone to notice, so I've stopped trying to pay a debt. I'm just trying to be worth noticing." Zuri smiled. The bracelet, hers and its twin on his wrist, catching the Lagos sun as she reached for his hand. She thought of the lobby 6 months ago, of Malik's laugh, of a room full of strangers who'd assumed a maid's whole worth could be measured by her uniform. She thought of a cistern, of gunfire, of a boy who had grown into a man who bowed to her in front of everyone who'd ever underestimated her. She had lost a husband who called her nothing. She had gained a brother who called her family, a system that finally protected women who looked like her, and 470 children who would never have to learn, the way she once had, that kindness goes unrewarded. It hadn't, in the end. It never had.